here's my information on the screen for those that have not heard me speak or want to connect with me. Please reach out. Like Allison said, we love to interact with you guys, so follow me on Twitter, LinkedIn, or shoot me an email and follow up. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask a question during the session. If you have any technical difficulties, please also put something in the chat as well. We'll ask some questions as we go through as well. So before we jump in, let me ask you guys a question real quick. How many of you guys have ever failed at anything, right? And I'm sure all of you guys are kind of nodding your head like, yeah, we've all failed at something. And I love this quote by Michael Jordan that, you know, one of the greatest NBA players of all time, and probably the greatest, and also a Tar Heel, so go Heels. But it's one of those things where you kind of read right there in the middle. On 26 occasions, he's been asked to take the game-winning shot and he's missed. But we still think of him as the most successful person and successful player in all of the NBA history. So why is that? And because of his on this, that's why, you know, he is successful. And there's others, you know, Beethoven and Einstein, and the list goes on and on about failure. So that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon. What better way to spend a Thursday afternoon than talking about failure, right? It's going to be good. So before we jump in, I want to share some news with you guys. I've got bad news and I've got good news, and I'll share the bad news first to get it out of the way. So the bad news is over 60% of you guys that are doing SharePoint, getting ready to start SharePoint, are going to struggle, stall, or flat out fail with your implementations. And before you get off the webinar, I want to go through and kind of share some of the good news that we have about this. The good news is that, you know, a lot of us will face these things, but you're not alone, right? So 3 out of 5 of you guys are going to struggle. A lot of people missing deadlines. A lot of people are over budget, and you're not alone. And we've gone through and almost obsessed about this as an organization on this failure, and this is where this session comes from. And I'll talk a little bit more about it later on. So that's the bad news. The good news is we know the reasons why. We spent a lot of time. That's where this session, like I said, came from. We spent a ton of time researching why these organizations are failing, why they're struggling, and what's going on. So over the next 45, 50 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the reasons these are failing, the 7 deadly sins, and we'll talk about how you guys can do better. So as I mentioned, a quick recap of kind of what we're going to go through today. So we're going to talk first about 3 universal truths that we see with every SharePoint project. 3 things that you guys may not even know exist, but they're going to be in every single project. So I want you guys to know about these. The next thing I want to talk about is obviously the 7 sins. One of the main reasons you guys are here. I'm going to share 3 case studies from real clients and real projects that we had where sins were committed, what happened, and how we kind of turned those around and got on a better path. And then, like I like to do in all my sessions, I'll try to end this with how can you guys leave this session with some practical tips. Obviously, I can't share everything in an hour time frame. I'd love to spend, you know, the entire day kind of talking through these issues, but there's so much to talk about. So this is where I want you guys to reach out to us, say, hey, do you have any more? I'm going to share some resources at the end of this as well that you guys can download, and we're happy to share whatever we can for you guys to be successful. So let's jump in. So the first thing I want to go through in the next 5-10 minutes or so are these 3 universal truths that are apparent in every SharePoint project. So the first thing I want to talk about is it's not about SharePoint. And I know you guys are here because you're probably doing a SharePoint project. Maybe you're starting a SharePoint project. Maybe you're right in the middle of a SharePoint project. Maybe you're struggling and don't know how to move forward. Maybe you're stalled and people aren't adopting it, or you don't know what to do next, or you got halfway in and realized that you didn't do any planning and this thing's not turning out like you thought it would. So what we always like to talk to clients about is it's not about SharePoint. It never has been and it never will be. It's always about other things, and things such as, you know, employee engagement, productivity, relationships, business value, customer service. How are we going to innovate better? How are we going to do things better and share knowledge within our organization? How are we going to scale as an organization? So all these things, and this list goes on and on. There's hundreds of these items that you could talk about from a standpoint of, you know, why are we really doing this? So the first thing I always like to tell people is forget about SharePoint for a minute. It's a great tool, but it's just like any other tool, and we've got to make sure we're using it in the right way. But at the end of the day, you're not hammering, you're trying to solve a problem. You're trying to hammer a nail. So what are you trying to do? And I'll talk more about the tool thing a little later on. Another reason why this is so important is Gartner had a study that came out a couple of years ago that talked about as much as 75% of the information that we share and get within an organization comes directly from other people that are around us. Now, maybe that's through a tool such as SharePoint, but we're getting information from other people. We're communicating, we're collaborating, and that's how 75% of this information exchange happens inside of an organization. So if we cut out good collaboration, if we cut out these things, then does that mean we're missing 75% of the information that exchanges between us? So it's super important to realize that it's not just about the technology and the tool, it's about how are we going to connect these people together and how are we going to make it better for people to work together and to come together and connect. The next truth I want to share with you guys is that there's huge upside to SharePoint, a lot of rewards with SharePoint. You hear all the numbers and all the productivity, and we can do this, and especially if you're going to 365 now, where you can save on hardware and you can save on these things. But a lot of people kind of either don't know or just ignore that there are also risks. And with everything in life, right, there's a reward and there's a risk. And so we always like to talk about that up front. A lot of people try to shy away from it, but for us, we want to talk about, look, if you're going to go into this, go into it with eyes wide open. So along with all these rewards, there are huge risks. You know, a lot of adoption issues, a lot of people can't find things, people recreating information. And again, these are just 6 of many stats that we have on why projects are great and why they can really struggle. And we go through a lot with organizations trying to help them identify the risk early on so that you can know about them as well. And then the last thing I want to share with you guys in terms of kind of as you guys approach these projects is that SharePoint needs more attention than you think. So how many of you guys know what this is, right? Everybody knows what this is on the screen. This is a Gantt chart. Most of you guys that are doing a project or have been on a project know what a Gantt chart is, right? And this is actually one from a project that we did with a client. This is the phase 1. So you can see it doesn't look huge, right? And I know I've got some things collapsed in there, but there's a task on here, but they're usually at a high level. And a lot of organizations think, well, I got to go around to the business. I get that. I've got to get a punch list of things or a wish list, or this guy in HR wanted this, or this lady over here in legal wanted these things, and let's then go build it, right? Let's spend all the time building it. What we actually see happen is when you take this Gantt chart and you take this project plan, what it actually is behind the scenes is something more like this, right? So when there were 10, 15, 20, 50 tasks, there are now hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of decisions that have to be made. And most of these decisions, to be honest, have nothing to do with the technology, the configuration, how's that workflow going to be built, those kind of things. The decisions are, we've got this one document, and actually IT, legal, and HR need to see it. So how do we make it visible to those guys and also meaningful? Where do we put it? Where do we store it? What kind of things do we need? How do we get it searched? You know, those kind of things. So there's a ton of different things that you guys have to think about as you go through it. And tasks interrelate. There are dependencies on tasks between them, and decisions that are related to one relate to another as well. So we always like to paint this picture to let people know that it's not just kind of a set it and forget it, turnkey application. A lot of people, we're starting to see this shift a little bit, but a lot of people think that SharePoint is a lot like Exchange, and where it's just kind of an application you just put in place and it just works, just like your email or your Office or anything like that. And it's so much more than that. And those of you that are on the call, I think, get that and want to see that change. But it is really important for you guys to slow down and make sure you're thinking about all the different decisions and understanding those. And I've got some questions at the end that you guys can ask to go through that. One step is pretty interesting, and this is something we even found with our organizations that we work with, is that for every $1,000 that you spend in project costs, so labor, whatever it is, consulting, for every $1,000 there's 3 to 4 decisions that have to be made. So if you're just doing a $100,000 project, there's 300 to 400 individual decisions that have to be made on that project, not just configuration and technology, but how are we going to do this? Who's that going to impact? What is the risk? How are we going to mitigate that risk? And it goes on and on and on. So again, it needs a ton more attention than I think a lot of organizations are giving it, and that's part of our message is slow down, think about it, and try to figure out what problems you're trying to solve before you go forward with the technology. And so with that, I'll kind of move into the 7 deadly sins. So this is the main kind of meat of the presentation, and I'm going to go through 7 areas where we really see things, impacting organizations. Why are they struggling? And before I do that, what I want to do is kind of talk for just a minute about why we came up with the 7 deadly sins and where that came from. So you can see this stat on the screen here in this kind of pie chart. But a few years ago, we actually noticed that a lot of organizations coming to us saying, hey, can you help us out were struggling, and they weren't putting in these applications for the first time. They weren't trying to do SharePoint brand new. They already had these products, SharePoint, CRM. We do both of those. But on the SharePoint side, I mean, they already had SharePoint, and they were struggling with adoption, or as one lady called, to me, she said, I think we're through the honeymoon period. We had about a good year, a run. Everybody was excited, and now it started to fizzle out. And so there's a lot of issues, and we started to notice that, man, there's a lot of people coming to us that already have these things, and it's just they're struggling. Sometimes it was set up wrong and configured wrong, but I would say 9 out of 10 times it was something else that was causing the failure. And so what we did was we stepped back and said, how much is this? And it was about 60% of our work, and it still holds true today. 60, even a little higher now, of our work is what we call CPR, or this resuscitation. So that's where this comes from. We take pride in saying that we're kind of experts in failure. We've seen a lot of failed and struggling projects, and that's why we built this deck. And we've taken everything that we've learned and kind of baked it into our process that we apply to our client projects going forward. So, clients are very happy, they're engaged, and projects are way more successful. So that's where this came from. Just wanted to share that for a minute so you guys would have some context. So, how many of you guys have been on a road trip, right? We've all been on road trips. We get ready to go on a long trip. Let's say we're driving cross country from North Carolina to California. And so we set our destination in our GPS. And honestly, before we go, especially on a long trip like that, we plan it out. We probably decide, is it winter, summer? Are we going to go north through the Dakotas? Are we going to go south through Texas? Where are we going to go? How are we going to go? What's the weather along the way? Where are we going to stop? Are we going to try to make it across the Mississippi and then stop for a break? We do all those things when we're planning trips, right? All of you guys do that. But it's so amazing to us when we look at projects that are much longer, spending a whole lot more money usually, and a lot more investment, not only in just money, but time and resources, and there's no clear plan of how do I even know when I've reached, the West Coast? How do I even know when I'm done? What are the check boxes that need to be checked that say, we've completed phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. How do I know when I finish this project? And it doesn't have to be a 6-month process of laying out this huge, overly complex roadmap. We spend a lot of time with organizations and have a pretty rapid way that we go through this in a matter of about 4 to 6 weeks, with only about a week on site with a client, and we can come back with this nice roadmap all the way down to the milestone level of where you're going, how you know when you get there, and how we're going to measure how we get there. So make sure your goals are measurable. Make sure you've got a roadmap. We see a lot of organizations that get started just because they quote-unquote want to do an intranet, right? And so that's one of the things we hear. And my first question is, well, why do you want to do an intranet? And what does an intranet mean to you? Is that document sharing? Is that corporate communication? What do you need it to do? Why are you doing an intranet? Is it really an intranet? Those kind of things. So there's a lot more to it. So make sure you've got clear and measurable goals. And I'll show you guys a couple stats that are pretty amazing that show just how important this planning process is. So you can see these on the screen. I won't go through each one. But just from a standpoint of being strategic, making sure that you've got a strategy for why we're doing that, making sure you're measuring. How are we doing? Are we on the same path that we set out and said we were going to? There's always going to be detours. There's always going to be road closed. Mergers, acquisitions, those kind of things, but make sure you can measure your progress and then be very specific. It's amazing here, 75% of the project team members think that the project's going to fail because they just don't have any clear objectives. They're just kind of fuzzy, and people think one thing's going on and something else is going on, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, which kind of leads us to the unrealistic expectations, right? Most of you guys have probably been let down at some point in your life, and a lot of times they say, if you've been let down, you got to lower your expectations because your expectations are too high, and sometimes that's true, but we see it a ton in SharePoint projects where organizations go into it with this mentality of, man, it's just going to make us so much more effective, and yeah, I see these stats for 240% more productive. If we put this in place, everybody's going to start using it and sharing documents, and we're going to be able to find things so much faster. And you guys are probably all shaking your head like it never happens. We've never seen it once to this day happen that way. And you're also going to have, from a user perspective, users saying, well, the other way I used to do it was so much more, effective, and it was so much faster. It was only one step, and now I've got to do 3 steps to do this. Or I built the old way. It was so much better. I've been doing it for 20 years. Why are you having me doing it this new way? And so part of it is kind of managing the user expectation, but also what is the expectation of the project. So here's how we see this kind of play out within an organization. It's interesting because a lot of organizations, I mean, they've started, as they got going, most of the processes you guys have today weren't born overnight, right? They took a long time, and they were kind of worn in, like this footpath you guys see on the left here. So over time, we built processes and built things up, and you started with one spreadsheet, and now you got 200 spreadsheets that you're trying to kind of piece together and figure out how to make it work. And it's working. It can get you there, get you from point A to point B, but the process doesn't scale that well, right? It doesn't get you there. So you think about, man, we need to be going faster. We need to be there. We need to have this huge collaboration, all these tools, Yammer, whatever it is, integrated, and we want to get to the superhighway. And so in that arrow, going from the footpath to the superhighway, they try to throw SharePoint. They try to put SharePoint in this big technology piece, or maybe it's multiple technologies, right in this path, and they try to make it this quick jump and this quick fix to get to a superhighway. But in this process of kind of throwing the quick fix, throwing SharePoint at it, we find that most organizations end up with something like that. And so they paved over this worn footpath. It's a little wider, maybe it's a little smoother, you can go a little faster, still get you there, but it's a long way from a superhighway. And we've got this process that's kind of cobbled together. Some people like it, some people are falling off the edge, some people don't like it at all. And why didn't we make it to the superhighway? And the truth is, to make it from this kind of footpath and trying to go from how we're doing it today to being very effective with SharePoint and with collaboration, it's a process. And just like any construction process around your hometown, if they're widening a road, you don't drive one day on a 2-lane road and come out the next day and it's a 4-lane road. It's a process, right? So it looks more like this. And so we see this all the time where organizations are either scared of this phase or try to rush through this phase or somehow try to avoid going through this construction phase. And anything that is progress and get you from point A to point B is going to have to go through this construction phase. And that's part of managing the expectation, not only with the organization. It's your responsibility to manage that with the leadership, to help them understand how it works, with the users, that look, we're going to get there, but look, we're going to go down to 1 lane while we widen it to 4 lanes. And it's going to slow down before it speeds up. And there's going to be a process. And a healthy project actually goes through this construction phase. Now the key is to get through this construction before you sit in there for a year, 2 years, and kind of get stalled, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. So the key is we want to go through construction, we got to manage that process, that's how it's going to happen, we're going to get through that, but at the same time, how do we get through it quickly and efficiently and make sure we're doing it the right way and don't get hung up in this kind of stalled construction phase. This one is probably top 1 or 2 of all the sins. So I love tools. I'm a tool guy. I've got a bunch of tools in my garage. I love new tools. But we see a lot of organizations running out and kind of grabbing the new tools off the shelf, if you will, and then kind of running around and saying, now how do I use this tool? And I love this analogy where I say that a lot of people today are basically going out to their garage, grabbing a hammer, and then walking around their house and saying, now what can I hammer? What can I beat on? Or they go to their neighbor or a colleague or someone else they know in another business to say, now how are you using your hammer? What should I do with my hammer? And that's what people are doing with SharePoint. They're buying SharePoint, they're getting SharePoint, maybe because they had 365, maybe because they had the licenses, and they said, we got this, let's just go. Tell me what we need to do with it. And people are coming to us saying that, what do we need to do with it? And my first question is, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to solve? We don't just walk around with a hammer and say, what can I beat on? And that's really what people are doing, and they're starting with this mentality. So again, part of that reframe is, it's not about SharePoint. Put down the tools and start to focus on what are you trying to achieve. And a lot of people right now, we've got SharePoint 2016 announced and coming out and very soon, and we're working with that as well. You've got some people that are on 2007. Some of you guys are probably on 2010. All these new versions, and a lot of organizations are saying we got to go to 2016. We've got to go to 2013. And again, taking this tool mentality, and I can guarantee you, an upgrade or a new version of the tool is not going to fix the problems you have today. And I'll show you a stat that we actually took from that 60% that were coming back to us. So on the screen you can see this, that we actually went and asked organizations how often they're trying to implement SharePoint. And maybe it was a new version, maybe it was trying to do some other tool, maybe they skipped a version, whatever it was. And the first time it was about what we saw, about 40% satisfied, about 60% failure rate. Now as they try to do it the second time, now maybe they learned a few things, it was nice and cool for a little while, so we got a nice bump, but it wasn't that big. It wasn't even 50% satisfaction rate because obviously the underlying issues were still there. And as they started to do 3, 4, 5 more times, it started to go down drastically because obviously people that were on that team were like, I'm not being on another SharePoint project. This thing is just going to fail like all the other ones before it. Why should I do it? And people start jumping ship left and right. So again, throwing technology at it is not going to fix it. It's not the problem, and it's definitely not the solution as well. And that's what I want to kind of really drill home to you guys is, you know, make sure that you're focusing on the problem you're trying to solve. What are we trying to do? How do we enable our users, and not on how are we going to use SharePoint, right? And not doing that. And then the last stat I'll show on this is by Gartner. So AIAM was the first stat I showed you guys that was about 63% failure. Gartner had a study that came out a couple years ago as well that said 80% of these collaboration and social efforts are not going to achieve the benefits that people set out to. People are going to be let down because of inadequate leadership and an overemphasis on technology, right? So people focusing too much on the content and the technology and what they're trying to do with this tool, then what are we trying to solve in the first place, and how are we going to lead it and get it there? So really can't talk about that one enough. It's super important, and I want you guys to make sure that as you go into this, you don't worry so much about SharePoint, because honestly that's the easy part, and I'll talk about that one in just a minute. So this one I've kind of named different things over the year, but it always comes back to the same thing. People are at the heart of every SharePoint project. And I know a lot of people often don't like to think about this, but if you didn't have people in your organization, or even people using it, or people working on SharePoint, none of us would have jobs. None of you guys would be on here on this webinar trying to learn more about SharePoint and how we can do better with it, right? People are the ones that are using these tools to create things. People create things and stuff in our organizations. So it's important that these tools support the people, right? And we see organizations, it's funny, it sounds strange, but we see a lot of organizations getting caught up in, we've got to implement this technology and that technology, and we've got to get the integration right, the whole time forgetting about, is that easy for the user? Is that making their job harder? Who is it impacting? Negatively? Positively? What am I doing this for? Why am I doing this? And somewhere along the way in all these shiny new tools, we forgot why we're building these things in the first place. And SharePoint is, at its core, a collaboration platform. And collaboration is people working together, right? I mean, we're trying to connect people. And there's a lot of ways you can go about this. One of them is make sure that when you're developing your SharePoint plan, that you've got immediate value in every single phase. We see it a lot of times where organizations will plan something out and get a big project team and get people fired up, and the next thing you know, about a year down the road, there's been nothing but the infrastructure built, and people are like, what happened with SharePoint? Why did that fizzle out? Where are we with that? And because people just stop caring about it. So I want to talk a little bit about how, you know, I mentioned people were at the heart of collaboration, right? And so this is kind of a nice image I like to show, where I talk about how this actually takes place in your organization. A lot of people don't see this beyond the SharePoint and beyond the tool, but at its core, in order, I mean, obviously number 4 is where we're all trying to get, right? We're all trying to get to this place where we have innovation and we have collaboration and all these great things, and just people are excited to work, and we're developing new things such as new processes, new products, better customer service, all these things going on. But it all starts at number 1 with connections. It all starts with how are we going to bring people together in friction-free ways, and I always like to throw that in there because you can bring people together, but you can make it really difficult for those people to work together. So how do we get people to come together easy? How do we make it easy for them? How do we give them a platform and a place where it can be really easy? How do we make it not difficult for them to come together? And then honestly, once you start that process, which SharePoint can definitely help with, then you start to have relationships that are formed. And that's almost natural from everyone. I mean, all of us want to build relationships. So when you can bring people together and give them something to work on and give them a good place to do it, then people can begin to form these relationships, which then leads to engagement. Why I come into the office, I want to do this, I'm excited about my work, which then obviously leads to innovation. And this is kind of the life cycle of collaboration. This is how it happens. And SharePoint can sit right there in the middle and can really start with that number 1 of bringing people together. So I've got a whole other slide called Failure to Connect, where I take this concept and talk about it for an entire hour. You can view it on SlideShare. We'll do other webinars on that as well. And I think it's up on our YouTube channel as well. So you can view that one, and it talks just about why are people failing to connect and work together as well. So you can't forget about the people. You've got to make sure you've got people integrated into every step of the way, and get people involved as well. And you'll be amazed at how adoption and all those things go up as well. So the last thing I want to share is, again, I love stats, and mainly because I want you guys to hear this from someone else besides myself, right? You could say, oh, well, C5's making that up, or they're doing this, and I try to show you kind of where these things come from. But again, this is from Gartner, from part of that study, and you can go download this study as well. It's out there on the web. But again, talking about how there's so much focus on the content, the technology, what are we going to use to build this, and the tools, and not enough on the relationships, the leadership, these initiatives about change that are happening in an organization to make it successful. And it really is true. That's why 80% of the people from Gartner's study are struggling with these efforts, because they're just not understanding how people are working and how they're integrating in their organization. How many of you guys remember this little firm called Enron a few years ago, right? So Enron gave us so many things, right? A lot of people think that they were this bad company, but they gave us so many things. So we've got all this compliance and this regulation that we have now inside your organizations, and many of you guys on the webinar probably have some sort of legal compliance or regulatory thing that you guys have to do that has to be a part of your SharePoint. Maybe it's retention, maybe it's how long we keep things, maybe it's versions, whatever it may be. And so it's pretty interesting that there was a stat I came across, and I wanted to put it up here, that I mean, it really is true. There are over 14,000 different laws and regulations around just electronic records, papers, keeping tabs on things like that. I can guarantee you don't have to implement every one. And don't hear me wrong, because we're huge proponents of governance. We work with all of our organizations and our clients on governance plans. We have a governance toolkit for people that can come to us and say, hey, I want to do governance on our own. Can you help us kind of do a boot camp? We've got a governance boot camp. We do a ton of different things around governance, and it's near and dear, and your project will not succeed without it. But in all the talk about governance, we've actually seen governance go too far, and people take it too far to where it's actually starting to be kind of against collaboration and causing people to not collaborate as well. And a lot of people really won't talk about that and aren't seeing that, but we see it, and so I wanted to mention it to you guys. So what I want you guys to do for just a minute is kind of visualize this sphere that I've got on the screen here as your SharePoint environment, right? And so there are always these multiple layers of things that you've got to manage. And so what we came up with to kind of easily remember this is that your SharePoint and your governance methodology and process should be rigid at the core and flexible at the edges. And so in every organization, you guys have things that are non-negotiables, right? You guys have things such as your corporate metadata, your retention policies, your auditing, legal requirements, the homepage content that only one or two people or a group of people can manage, published articles that are final and have content approval on them, right? There's some non-negotiables and things that you're like, we just have to have these things to be legally compliant. This is what we have to do, and that's your core, and those things should be there. But we find people that take this rigid at the core and they expand it throughout the entire SharePoint sphere, and so it goes out to all the edges. So next thing you know, everything's locked down all the way out to the team sites. So at the edges, what you have are your My Sites, your OneDrive for Business, your collaboration team areas, your project sites, some of the news feeds out there, and things all the way down to personal views, check in, check out, and you guys know how many options there are at that level, down at the document library and list level. Once you get out to these team sites, those should be a little more relaxed, because we found that people want to be able to work how they work, and if you've got different groups working together, they're all going to work differently. And some groups have 23-year-olds working with 55-year-olds on the same projects, and they're going to work differently, and they need different things than maybe the legal department or the HR department. So give them the flexibility and empower them to be able to create the things they need to collaborate. It's amazing what it does for adoption, engagement, satisfaction on the product, and a lot of people just want to lock it down, and they're so afraid that, oh, someone's going to say something, or I've got to moderate every comment. And I can tell you, in all the years we've been doing this, we've never seen that happen, because one, people just don't do it. If you give them the flexibility and say, you own this and I trust you, people typically don't do it. And two, hopefully they don't do it because they know that you can see everything that's done, right? There's auditing, there's a name on everything that's being done. So we just don't see it being done out there, so we want people to kind of loosen up, if you will, when it comes to these collaboration areas outside of that. So that's one of the things. And then the next one I want to talk about is kind of this. Let's go back to this analogy of the road trip, right? So if you're on a road trip, most of you guys, if you're cruising along, and I hate driving, I would rather fly anywhere, but you set the cruise control, right? It makes your job a little easier. You don't, your leg gets tired, you can set the cruise control, but I can guarantee you don't take your hands off the wheel. And we see a lot of organizations that not only set the cruise control, but they also take their hands off the wheel. And I can tell you what happens with that really quickly. And you guys can probably figure that out pretty quickly as well. And so a lot of organizations, we have one organization, perfect example, they have 40 capital projects just within the IT group, 40 projects going on at one time. So they were, I mean, when they came to us, they were like, we got to get this thing done. As soon as we're done, they're going to wipe their brow and on to the next project. And SharePoint just cannot be done that way. It's a collaboration platform. Our organizations are changing. Collaboration is changing. We've got, millennials in the organization. We've got Gen Z coming out in the next 5 years. Our organizations change all the time, right? They're these living, breathing organisms. And so this tool, unlike Exchange and some of these other things that can just be set in place and they just work until the next version you want to upgrade it, you've got to maintain these. And most of you guys that own a house probably haven't run out of projects to do, right? You probably all have projects to do at your house. So it's the same way. There's always things to do. And I'm going to give you guys a tool at the end of this webinar. If you hang on, I'll give you a URL. You can download it that will help you capture feedback from your users that we found is a tremendous value for users with adoption and capturing, what they're thinking. So make sure that you don't just kind of set your project on a course, and that you have a process for constantly checking in on it. How is it going? Those kind of things. We do a lot of setting up steering committees and those kind of things as well. And so, we've actually found that even after the project's finished, the longest we go between steering committee meetings is every quarter. So while the project's going on, they may be bi-weekly, monthly, those kind of things. But after it's deployed, the last phase, whatever it is, we're still meeting quarterly to make sure, are we still doing the things we said? Are we capturing feedback? Are people still using it? Are people not using it? What happens when we get new people that come in? How do they get trained? How are they using it? So I always like to kind of show this picture. Most of you guys know what this is on the screen, right? Most of you guys have this on your car, right? It's an engine light. And I can guarantee you when this is coming on, you're driving cross country, you're driving to your office, this comes on, you probably don't just stick black tape over it and then keep driving, right? You probably look at this, you take it into the dealer, and you probably figure out what's going on. But we see a lot of organizations that have these things, these dashboard lights that come on, and they ignore them. And one of the biggest things that we see inside of an organization that will tell you how your project's gonna do is how is it moving along. And I always like to put this up there that SharePoint projects stall before they fall. So we almost always see them before they flat out fail and they go really badly. We almost always see them kind of really slow down. And that doesn't mean that between phases there's lulls in the activity, but there's a difference. You can tell, and if you want to reach out, I can talk to you more about this. There's this sense that we just don't really know where to go next. People just aren't happy, but we don't really know how to fix it, and it just kind of gets into this stalled state. And the next step is people are just going to stop using it. They're going to set up their own Dropbox accounts, and it's going to be abandoned. And we see that across the board. We actually see something like this where you'll have this abandoned project on the side of the road, and it's amazing. I saw this stat from another management consulting firm that said over a third of organizations have abandoned a major project in the last 3 years, where they've just thrown it out. And you guys are spending a ton of time and money on these projects. You don't want to just throw it away. And so one of the key indicators that you guys can look for is, how are we doing? Is this thing moving along? Are we progressing? How are we doing toward our roadmap? Or are we just kind of struggling along and just kind of wandering out there and don't really know how to fix it, and people aren't happy, but I don't really know what to do to make them happy? So reach out to us. We've got a lot of insight on how to get things going again, because that's a lot of what we work on. A lot of organizations come to us, and it's in that stalled, stagnant, kind of wandering stage. And how do we get those how do we get people re-engaged and get those restarted as well? And then the last thing I want to talk about is this concept of not enough training and communication. So as a consulting firm, this is what a lot of people want to drop out. Honestly, they want to not train people. They want to, hey, give us a day of training, and we'll train the trainer, and we'll go on our way and kind of do that. And there's a lot of different things that we talk about in this, and I've come up with 2 that I want you guys to kind of take away, and 2 things. And I like to give people things in kind of these short snippets, so you guys can kind of take this information. So on the left side, we've got prepare. So there's two things you want to do when you talk about your people and how you're communicating and how you're preparing them for this. So prepare, how do we get them ready to use this tool that we're going to use? And we found that people always use what they understand. If someone doesn't understand the tool, how I can use it, when to use it, when not to use it, what's it good for, what's it bad for, not down to, hey, here's how you kick off this workflow and here's how you upload a document, but why do I use this tool? When would I use a hammer versus a screwdriver? Because that's what people want to know, and at some point we all had to learn that as well, right? So how do I use this tool? What is it for? People are going to be much more comfortable, and they're going to get in there and start to be more empowered. Create ambassadors and champions. We've got one organization that has 30 different champions across the organization in like 4 or 5 locations. create ambassadors, learn early on. A steering committee will help you kind of find those, but do some surveys, start doing some chatter, start figuring out who your people are that are going to really be your champions for SharePoint, because you're only so big, right? There's only so many people on your team, and some of you guys may be a team of one trying to do this. So how do I get people to help me spread this message? We know it's good. Find those people. They exist in your organization. How do I get them out there? And they will help you take that message. And then from a preparation standpoint, start early and repeat. So two things on this. One, we actually start every one of our projects in parallel. If it's on-premise, building the servers, first phase, very early on, we actually start training long before, we've even sometimes started building things or started going through that process. Because what we found is that if we run these in parallel, by the time we get to the end of that first phase or that first sprint, people understand it and they're engaged and you've got excitement. Most people think about just waiting till they get to the end of the project and kind of having this quote-unquote training event. We get to deployment, we get everybody in a room or do a video, a webcast, and we train everyone at that point. But what happens when you hire 50 people next week or 1,000 people next year? Like one of our clients, they were growing at 1,000 people a year. What happens to those people when you've had this training event? The event's already passed, so how do those people get up to speed on the product? How do they understand what they're supposed to do? How do you train them? What is your process for that? Do you have lunch and learns in place where these ambassadors and people can do lunch and learns or kind of weekly touch-ins on these things and do video training and those kind of things? So make sure you're starting early and make sure you constantly have a process for repeating this message and helping to train people. Have a center of excellence for your training or a training center where people can go and get the resources and have people they can go to find out. And then on the proclaim side, how do we get the message out there? And communication, over the years, we've seen it become more and more and more important because there's a lot of confusion out there with all the technologies. If you guys are on 365 or thinking about 365, it's changing almost daily, right? And so every week there's something new. You've got Delve, you've got Yammer, you've got Office Graph, you've got all these new functionalities coming out. People are confused and people want to know what the plan is, what the vision is. So spread the news. Make sure that you've got a plan, a communication plan. We put that together as part of our governance and our steering committee kickoffs as a communication plan. What channel am I going to use to communicate that? Who's going to communicate it? At what point in the project do we communicate that news? So, training versus launch versus yours is coming next. It's amazing what communication can do to help with expectations, with people getting frustrated because, well, I thought mine was coming next, but yours is coming next. Here's the plan, here's the process, helping people understand. Get people involved. It's amazing, again, goes back to the ambassadors. People will always support what they help create. So make sure you get people involved and make sure you get them excited about what they're building and get them involved. And we do that as part of our roadmap process. Our roadmap process gets many, many people involved in the exercises, and it's amazing. It was kind of a byproduct of going through that process. We have a roadmap, but at the same time, everybody's helped create the roadmap. So no one wonders, well, IT did this in their closet, and now they came out and said, let's build this thing. And then lastly, make it easy to provide feedback, and I'm going to give you guys a tool on that at the end. So as we go through, we've got about 20 minutes left on this session. I want to go through 3 case studies for you guys on organizations, and maybe you can see some of yourself in some of these case studies. I'll go through these, and then we'll finish out with some things that you guys can do and some questions you guys can ask and some tools that you guys can have. So the first one I like to call How the West Was Won. And if you want more details on these, reach out to us. But this one was interesting because on the surface, it looked like a really good, well-planned project, right? It was small scope. It was a pilot group. I think 8 or 10 different people. We got the group together. We figured out what they wanted, and we released it for this small group. But shortly after the deployment, news traveled fast at the water cooler, right, and at the coffee in the morning. And so people were like, "Man, I'm using this new site, and what about that?" And people were saying, "What do you mean? You're using this? Well, that's kind of cool. I want to see it." So what do you guys think was missing with that? So it was governance, right? So they didn't put any governance in place, even though everything looked good on the surface with a small project. They didn't put any governance in place for who's going to use this. They didn't communicate who was first, who was second. We're doing this pilot project. It was just kind of like, hey, let's get this group. We think this is the right group, and let's go forward and let's not communicate it. We'll worry about communicating it when we get to the other groups. And that was a big mistake. And so it spread like wildfire, and I think before they came to us, they had 900 sites that people had created out there just willy-nilly all over the place. It was amazing, just the sprawl that had happened in the organization. You guys are probably shaking your head like, oh, yeah, we got some of that going on too. So they came to us and said, it's a mess. We've got people everywhere. We don't even know who's using it. We can look at the stats, but it's just out of control. How do we rein this in? So we kind of went through the process of first and foremost forming a committee, a governance team that could basically help us, what are the rules? Who's going to go first? What do you want to do here? And as you guys might expect, it's always harder to take things away from people once they're using them than it is, to not roll it out. So it was tough to go back to people and say, hey, we've got to roll this back. We've got to do some things with this to get you in alignment and figure out what needed to be done. So what are the rules of the road? How do we need to do it? So we kind of turned them around and started to get people engaged and started to communicate. But it was really hard and would have been a lot easier had we done that up front. But today, people are empowered. They like the product. They like it. But again, I mean, it wasn't for lack of excitement. It was actually overexcitement without governance in place. And so what looks like a really good thing on the surface, without this process and this governance, and again, rigid at the core and flexible at the edges, without that in place, it just ran wild, and then the business was hurting because there was just so much out there, and there were 10 different versions of a file, and you guys know how all that goes. So that was one of the cases where, again, looks good on the surface, but governance is super important, and you got to start early on, from day one, putting that committee in place and figuring out what can and can't we do and communicate that to the organization. The next one I like to call third time's a charm, and this one's interesting because the organization came to us after, so we were the third vendor that they brought in. So there were 2 other vendors that had tried to do something over about a 3 or 4 month period, and this organization had to meet a big deadline for a graduation. It was a university for graduation happening in May. So they came to us, gosh, I think it was March or April. I mean, there was like 6 weeks left in the project, and said, we fired the other 2 guys. They couldn't get this right. What are we going to do? And so we looked at it, and always up for a challenge, we kind of said, yeah, let's look at it, but we're going to have to do this the hard way, and you guys are going to have to listen to us and take our guidance. And they said that's fine. So one of the interesting things that I always like to point out with this is that if you've got a project, and this one can be taken a lot of different ways, but if you're in a project and it's not going well, and you could just continue to not go well, and it could continue to not go well for a long time, and it just kind of struggles, and that's what they could have done. They could have failed to meet their deadline. They could have struggled through this. We had to make some tough choices, and one of those tough choices was actually 2. One, we've got to get really serious about what functionality you guys need. You had all this functionality. You had 3 months. Time's up. We've got to go, and so we've got to really get serious about prioritization. So going through, we've got specific exercises that we actually take the team through to prioritize stuff, and it gets prioritization really quickly, gets everybody on board, and it's pretty amazing. So reach out to us if you want to learn more about that process. But so we went through that process and tried to prioritize things a lot. One of the things that actually came up and said, this is a non-negotiable, we have to have this, was actually something that would take more than 6 weeks just by itself to build. So that posed a huge problem. I mean, we were like, okay, if we build this the right way and do everything the right way we want to, it's going to take more time than we've even got to deploy this. So what do we do? So I use the analogy of kind of this a doctor on the battlefield, right? If you're on the battlefield, you don't have a hospital to get to. You've got to make sure that you put the tourniquet on it. You've got to stop the bleeding so that you can get the patient back to the hospital so they don't die, right? And then you can do the things and have the nice clean room and the surgery. But sometimes you've got to do things that aren't pretty, but it saves the life of the patient. And you guys are sometimes going to have to do things. We've seen it, a couple times. It doesn't happen a ton, but there are sometimes where projects are going so badly that you got to do something pretty drastic. And for this one, we had to build this thing. It was a lot of custom code, integrating CRM and SharePoint. We had to build that in a way that we wouldn't have done normally. And so we had to, I wouldn't even call it shortcuts, but we basically did some things that, hey, we don't want this to be in there long term. It's going to work. It's going to get you through deployment. There was no way they could push deployment because it was tied to graduation for the university. So what can we do to make this work, to make it successful, but to also save the life of the project and the patient, but it wasn't pretty. But what's the plan to get it, once we get to the hospital, how do we do that? So we actually had to go through and do some things, and we built this piece of functionality in about 2 weeks' time, where it would normally take 6 weeks to kind of build it out. But immediately after this went out, it was successful. We came back and did more roadmap, more planning, and re-architected and rebuilt that piece that got out there. But again, we got the patient to the hospital, and the patient survived, and the project survived. So that's just kind of an example of where sometimes you're going to have to make tough decisions. We've even seen some projects where you had to fire someone on the project because they were just sabotaging it, and it took a while to find that out, but you had to quote-unquote fire someone from the project, not from the organization, but that person should not be on the project. They're causing a lot of trouble or something like that. So sometimes you've got to make some really tough decisions. And then the last one I want to talk about is what I call the forgotten one. So this is probably one of the worst situations we've ever seen. And let's just say, you know, that, and don't hear this wrong. I've come from IT. I've got a very technical background, so I've been in that world as well. But a couple folks in IT basically had the software, and they said, hey, I think this would be great for the organization. I think implementing SharePoint will be awesome. So they went, stood up SharePoint on their servers, got SharePoint going, and kind of started to look and said, well, we've got all these file shares. Let's migrate everything to file shares. So it was really based around document management, but they were going to SharePoint in 2010 where it had the ratings and tagging and liking and a ton of new functionality. So there was a lot in the product, but they basically, to make a long story short, went, installed SharePoint, got it online, and when everyone left on a Friday, they migrated everything, and everybody came in on a Monday, and everything was moved to SharePoint from their file shares. And you talk about a revolt. I mean, it was insane. I mean, there were help desk calls and people calling that were literally saying, you know, hey, I've got an issue, where are my files? And the help desk, you know, support was saying, well, they're on SharePoint. And people were literally saying, what is SharePoint? And so people didn't even know what SharePoint was. There was no communication, no training on it. And one day, your P drive, your S drive is now on SharePoint. And I can tell you, please don't ever do that. And you guys are probably saying, that would never happen to me. But there are a million things like that happen where people don't get it communicated, and then you get frustration. And it's always harder to kind of back that up. This is not one of those places where you want to ask for forgiveness. All right, you want to make sure you talk about kind of what's going on and what's happening, and make sure you train people. So we had to go through this one and do anonymous surveys. I mean, this one, as you can imagine, had a huge black eye in the organization, and so we had to back it up. We had to get anonymous surveys, and one of the things we did was just turn off stuff that they didn't need. I mean, there were people that they just basically wanted to use it for file shares, but they had, you know, tagging and ratings, and when do I use a tag? When do I use a rating? What is this for? What do I use that? And all these things that were just causing people a lot of confusion. So we did some boot camps. We got people comfortable, and again, prepared people for what they were going to use. It was amazing how much just the communication and the process was. And what we found actually through the surveys was it wasn't so much the moving from file shares to this, because people could see and most of them could get the new functionality. What people were mad at and frustrated with is that no one told them it was happening. There was no communication that happened whatsoever. They didn't know the process. They didn't have training on it. They were uncomfortable. They were, you know, didn't know how to use it. So again, making sure you spend time preparing people for using this, because again, at the end of the day, it's always about people. So as we wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so, what I want to do is kind of talk through how we take these 7 sins beyond just avoiding the sins and how we put these together. So as we started looking at these 7 sins, and they're coming up here on your screen again, as we went through these 7 deadly sins, we started to notice something, and we started to look at these from all these clients that were coming back to us and saying, you know, what is going on with these? And what we realized was that they actually fell into 2 different categories: planning of projects and control of projects. And nothing in here was, you know, about, well, that wasn't configured right, or that workflow just didn't work and was giving me errors or something like that. There were a lot of issues, and technology was not one of them. Most of them were around, we didn't plan right, we didn't think about this, we didn't consider people, and we didn't have a process in place for managing this. So as we took this even further, one of the things we did was we looked at this and said, all right, well, conventional wisdom, and what are these organizations doing? Most of them were spending about 25% of their time on the control, the management of the project, those kind of things, and then the other side, 25%, was spending on, you know, all right, we know we've got to do a roadmap, we've got to do some planning up front, we've got to get some requirements, but we just need to spend a little bit of time, and then let's get to building this stuff. Let's start building it. So these are the ones that failed, and this is probably most of the time conventional wisdom. And what we actually found was that success actually looked more like this. We said, if, hey, all these people are spending 25% of their time on planning and control, and this is where most of the issues are, what if we shifted this a little bit? What if we had 40% of the time on control and planning, 40%, so about 80% of the time on planning and control, and about 20% on implementation. And just from this little shift, and again, there's a lot of things that go on in planning and control, just from this shift, project success went off the charts. It was amazing, because at the end of the day, it really is the hard part. The hard part is planning it, managing it, how are we going to keep it in check, how are we going to capture things that are great ideas but we can't get them in scope, all those processes that go behind this. Where are we going, how do we know when we get there, how do we measure if we've been successful? Once you have all that, you can hand it to someone and they can build it anytime they want to. It's kind of like building a house, right? It's easy to go out and build a house. You see these houses go up in a couple weeks, but the preparation and the architect and the lot and all these different things that go on behind the scenes takes a lot more time. So this is one of the things we did to kind of do it. So what I want to show you guys is really the SharePoint success formula, right? If you guys are ready, I'm going to show you guys this. All right, so if everybody's got that, we'll move on to the next slide, right? No, so it's really not that complicated. And honestly, hey, if anybody can tell me what that, I know there's a bunch of math nerds. I'm a math nerd. I know there's some on this webinar. If you guys can tell me what this formula is, shoot it to us, answer it in the question or the chat. We'll send you some cool C5 swag. We'll get you a nice package together and send it out to you. You can tell me what that formula is. But no, it's really not that simple. And honestly, as we looked at it, and it's not that complex. I mean, as we looked at it, we basically said there's really not a one-size-fits-all. I wish it were just where we could just put down a formula, but we found that organizations are all in different places. And so it's really your SharePoint success formula. There are some things you can do at every stage, but it really depends on where you guys are. And we've started to see this more and more and more. We tried to apply a lot of things, and there's some commonalities between these. But at the end of the day, you guys are all in different phases. So here's some questions on the screen. You guys can screenshot this. We're going to have this deck up as well on our slides here and everything, so you guys can download it. But just some questions to ask, where you guys are. And again, if I could put these kind of 3 words up there, if you guys are starting SharePoint or looking to do SharePoint, maybe you don't have SharePoint at all, maybe you're moving from something else, then you're kind of in the preparation stage, right? If you're getting ready to start a project, maybe it's launching next year, maybe you're getting ready to start a new phase, you guys need to stop and plan. And then if you're struggling, the first thing I could say is take a time out. Figure out why we're struggling. Who says we're struggling? When did we first notice we were off track? One of the ones in this starting that I want to point out, which will kind of lead us to our tools, is when would we be ready for this level of collaboration? A lot of people don't ask that, and they think that their entire organization is collaborative. Everybody says their organization is collaborative, right? So this one we've got a tool for, and I'm going to show you that next. And then the last one, under struggling, how do our people think we're doing? We've got a tool as well for that. It's very important to understand, I know how we think we're doing. We don't think we're struggling, but who thinks we're struggling, and how do our people think we're doing, and who says that? So the first tool I want to show you guys is what we call kind of a 60-second collaboration readiness assessment and success likelihood. So if you look at this, what you've got is a couple of questions. So if you look at the questions in the top left, and you can answer those honestly about your organization, check the boxes that sound like your organization, and then circle the number of the boxes you check. So if you check 2 or 3 there, then circle that number. And then the middle one, do the same thing. If that sounds like you, if you've got all 4 of those, then circle 4. And then what I want you to do is draw a line between these 2 numbers where it crosses the orange line. And that'll tell you what your likelihood is for SharePoint success. And it's not super scientific, but we've actually found this tool, again, takes less than 60 seconds to be amazingly accurate with how you can do this. So I'll give you one example. Say that you got 2 of those first items and only 1 of the second. Well, then you probably got a below average chance of actually succeeding with SharePoint. And there are reasons. So the more on the top left that you can get rid of, obviously the better, and the more on the middle there that you can have, the better you're going to be. So again, if you can get rid of those and have 0 on the first one and 4 on the second one, you can see where that will go, and you would have a very high chance of success. So again, what these go back to, nothing about technology in here. These go back to culture. And we found that kind of a lot of the foundational pieces that happen with successful projects and successful SharePoint happens with how are people going to use this? Again, people, culture, what are we trying to do here? So this is the first tool I want to show you. The next one I want to show you is something we built specifically for capturing feedback and user adoption. So we developed this tool called the Site Feedback Solution, and when you install it, it works on online and on-premise. When you install it, it installs this little feedback icon right up here on your suite bar on the top. And no matter where someone is in their SharePoint, you can do it per site collection, and no matter where they are in your SharePoint, they can click this feedback. It pops up a dialog box so they don't leave the page they're on, and they can quickly enter a comment. It copies and tracks the page they were on, and they submit this into a list where then you can set up alerts. You can then have permissions on this list and those kind of things. So you can have this list then be filtered, and you can group it, and you can start working this list from a standpoint of how are we going to do this from a steering committee standpoint. So it's amazing when we're working on projects we actually see, and when we're in SharePoint, we're task oriented. We're in there for a reason. So no one, you can ask them for feedback all day long. No one's going to say, oh, well, I'm going to go over here and turn on my email and email, Allison or Curtis about this issue and then go back to my work. No one does that. But with this, it's amazing how much feedback we were able to capture. So I want to give you guys 2 URLs where you guys can go download this right now. If you want to screenshot these and go get them, these are the URLs. c5n.co, SharePoint Readiness, c5n.co, Site Feedback Web Part. And it is case sensitive. The SharePoint Readiness and the Site Feedback Web Part are case sensitive. So if you guys want to grab those, go get those. Be happy to send them to us. If you think you know what the what that formula was, send that over to us. And I just want to end with this quote from Einstein. I know we're right at time, and it kind of sums up everything I'm talking about. And I love all these quotes by Einstein. He's got a bunch of quotes that are so amazing. If you've got an hour to solve a problem, don't spend 55 minutes thinking about the solutions. Think about the problem. What problem are you guys trying to solve? And your solutions are going to come a lot easier. SharePoint's probably going to be a big part of those solutions. But if you let the solution drive what you're doing, you'll never meet your goals that you guys are trying to do. You'll never get the value out of it. So I appreciate your time today. Here's our contact information. Please reach out to us. Happy to reach out, and send you guys a follow-up to this. I'm sure you will get a follow-up on the deck and all the pieces of information. But please don't be shy. Reach out to us, and appreciate everybody sticking around.